At 6:47 on the morning of June 6, 1944, Corporal Waverly Woodson Jr. crouched in a landing craft approaching Omaha Beach, Normandy, France. He was 21 years old, from Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, a medic with the 328th Barrage Balloon Battalion, the only black combat unit to land on D-Day. Around him, 26 other black soldiers pressed against the steel walls of the LCVP, waiting for the ramp to drop. Waverly gripped his medical bag with both hands. Inside, bandages, morphine, sulfur powder, tourniquets, everything he would need to save lives. The boat pitched violently in the rough seas. Men vomited. Some prayed. Waverly stayed quiet, focused. He had trained for this moment for 2 years. He knew what to expect: enemy fire, wounded men, chaos. What he did not know was that in approximately 4 minutes, German machine gun fire would tear through his landing craft before the ramp even dropped, that shrapnel would rip into his thigh and groin, that he would bleed through his uniform while treating other men's wounds, that he would spend the next 30 hours on that beach saving over 200 lives without rest, without relief, without anyone replacing him. And what Waverly could not possibly know, what would only become clear decades later, was that despite being recommended for the Medal of Honor by multiple officers, despite eyewitness testimony from dozens of men he saved, despite doing exactly what Medal of Honor recipients are supposed to do, he would be denied. Not because he was not brave enough, not because he did not save enough lives, but because he was black. And in 1944, the United States military did not give its highest honor to black soldiers. This is Waverly Woodson's story, the story of the man who saved D-Day for 200 soldiers and received nothing in return. If you want to see how a black medic saved 200 men on the bloodiest beach of D-Day, was recommended for the Medal of Honor, and then was denied for 61 years until his death, hit that like button. This is the hero America refused to honor. This is Waverly Woodson. Subscribe because his sacrifice deserves to be told. Back to Waverly. Waverly Woodson Jr. was born on August 3, 1922, in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, the only child of Waverly's sister and Joanne Woodson. His father worked as a Pullman porter on the railroad, one of the few jobs available to black men that paid a living wage. His mother worked as a domestic servant. The family lived in a modest row house in North Philadelphia, a predominantly black neighborhood where segregation was not official law, but was practiced nonetheless. Waverly attended segregated schools, graduated from John Bartram High School in 1940, and enrolled at Lincoln University, a historically black college in Pennsylvania. He was studying to become a teacher when America entered World War II. On December 7, 1941, Japan attacked Pearl Harbor. Within weeks, the United States was at war with Japan and Germany. The military began drafting millions of men. Waverly knew he would be drafted. In early 1942, rather than wait, he enlisted. He was 19 years old. He believed military service would earn him respect, would prove that black men were equal to white men, would help win not just the war overseas, but the war for civil rights at home. He believed this because many black leaders were telling young black men to believe it. The Double V campaign: victory abroad against fascism, victory at home against racism. Waverly enlisted believing in that promise. Waverly reported to Fort Meade, Maryland, for basic training in March 1942. The training was segregated. Black recruits lived in separate barracks, trained separately, were forbidden from entering white areas of the base. Waverly was assigned to the medical corps. The military placed many black soldiers in support roles: medics, cooks, drivers, laborers. Combat roles were reserved primarily for white soldiers, though some black combat units were being formed under pressure from civil rights organizations. Waverly did not object to being a medic. He believed saving lives was honorable work. Medical training lasted 16 weeks. Waverly learned battlefield medicine, How to stop bleeding, apply tourniquets, treat shock, administer morphine, dress wounds under fire. He learned to work fast, to prioritize casualties, to make life or death decisions in seconds. He learned that a medic's job was not to fight but to save those who did. He also learned that medics had the highest casualty rates of any non-combat role. Medics carried no weapons, wore red crosses on their helmets and armbands, and were supposed to be protected under the Geneva Convention. But in practice, enemy soldiers often targeted medics first. Kill the medic, and the wounded die. Waverly understood this. He trained anyway. After medical training, Waverly was assigned to the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion in December 1942. The 320th was a unique unit, an all-black battalion assigned a combat role. Barrage balloons were large hydrogen-filled balloons tethered to the ground by steel cables. They were flown over invasion beaches and military installations to prevent low-flying enemy aircraft from strafing or bombing. The cables could damage or destroy aircraft that flew into them. Operating barrage balloons was dangerous. The hydrogen was explosive. The balloons were targets for enemy fire, and the crews had to deploy them under combat conditions. The 320th consisted of approximately 500 men, all black except for some senior officers. Waverly was one of 6 medics assigned to the battalion. The 320th trained for a year in the United States, then shipped to England in late 1943. They continued training in England, preparing for the invasion of Europe. By early 1944, it was clear that a massive Allied invasion of France was imminent. The 320th was assigned to the first wave of the invasion. They would land on Omaha Beach on D-Day, deploy their balloons under fire, and provide anti-aircraft protection for the landing forces. The mission was extremely dangerous. The first wave always suffered the highest casualties. Waverly knew this. He prepared his medical supplies, wrote letters home to his parents, and waited. On June 5, 1944, the invasion was scheduled but postponed due to bad weather. On June 6, the invasion was launched. Over 150,000 Allied troops would land on 5 beaches in Normandy, Utah. Omaha Gold Juno soared. Omaha Beach was the most heavily defended. German forces had fortified the bluffs overlooking the beach with machine gun nests, artillery positions, mines, and obstacles. Intelligence estimated that American forces landing on Omaha would face withering fire. Intelligence was correct. Waverly boarded his landing craft at 4:30 a.m. on June 6, 1944. The sea was rough. Waves crashed over the sides of the boat. Men were soaked, cold, vomiting. The landing craft circled offshore for over 2 hours, waiting for the signal to approach the beach. At 6:30 a.m., the naval bombardment of Omaha Beach began. Battleships and destroyers fired thousands of shells at German positions. The bombardment was supposed to destroy the defenses. It did not. Most shells landed too far inland or hit empty positions. The German defenses remained intact. At 6:43 a.m., Waverly's landing craft began its approach to Omaha Beach. The craft was designated LCVP-72, carrying 27 men from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. Waverly was in the center of the craft, medical bags secured to his body. The boat pitched violently. Men braced themselves. The beach was now visible through the morning mist, a long stretch of sand backed by steep bluffs. German fortifications barely visible on the ridgeline. Smoke from the naval bombardment obscured details. The craft moved closer. 500 yards. 200 yards. At 6:47 a.m., German machine gun fire opened up. Bullets struck the front of the landing craft. The steel ramp absorbed most of the fire, but bullets came through gaps and over the sides. Men screamed. Waverly pressed himself against the side. The coxswain, the sailor operating the boat, was hit. He slumped over the controls. Another sailor took over. The craft kept moving toward the beach. 100 yards, 50 yards. The ramp was supposed to drop at the waterline. It dropped 30 yards offshore in chest-deep water. At 6:48 a.m. the ramp dropped. German machine gun fire poured into the landing craft. The first 6 men who stepped off were cut down before they reached the water. Waverly saw them fall. He had no time to process it. He jumped off the ramp into the water. The water was freezing, chest-deep rough. His medical bag was waterproof but heavy. He struggled to keep his footing. Bullets struck the water around him, creating small geysers. Men were screaming, some were hit and sank immediately. Waverly waded forward, trying to reach the beach. At 6:49 a.m., shrapnel from an exploding artillery shell tore into Waverly's left thigh and groin. The pain was instant and overwhelming. He fell forward into the water. Blood poured from the wounds, mixing with seawater. Waverly forced himself to stand. He could not stay in the water. Staying in the water meant drowning. He waded forward. His left leg would barely support weight. He stumbled, fell, stood again. He reached the beach at 6:52 a.m. and collapsed behind a steel anti-tank obstacle. Waverly assessed his wounds. Shrapnel had embedded in his left thigh, approximately 3 inches deep. Another piece had struck his groin, missing major arteries by inches. Both wounds were bleeding heavily. Waverly opened his medical bag with shaking hands. He pulled out a morphine syringe and injected himself. He opened a packet of sulfur powder and poured it into the thigh wound to prevent infection. He pulled out gauze and wrapped both wounds tightly, creating pressure bandages. The bleeding slowed but did not stop. Waverly knew he needed evacuation. He also knew evacuation was impossible. The beach was hell. Men were dying everywhere. Waverly looked around. Bodies floated in the surf. Men were crawling toward cover, many of them wounded. German machine gun fire swept the beach in bursts. Mortar shells exploded randomly. The sand was torn up from explosions and bullets. Waverly saw a soldier 20 yards away, lying on his back, holding his stomach. Waverly stood up, his left leg nearly buckled. He limped toward the soldier. The soldier was white, from the 116th Infantry Regiment, 29th Division. He had been shot in the abdomen. Intestines were visible through the wound. He was in shock, hyperventilating, dying. Waverly knelt beside him. He pulled morphine from his bag and injected the soldier. He opened a large trauma dressing and placed it over the wound. He could not close the wound properly under these conditions, but he could slow the bleeding and treat for shock. He wrapped the dressing tightly. The soldier stopped screaming. His eyes focused on Waverly. He said, "Thank you." Waverly said, "Stay down. Help will come." Waverly did not believe help would come, but he said it anyway. Waverly moved to the next wounded man, then the next, then the next. For the next 30 hours, Waverly Woodson did not stop working. He treated over 200 wounded men on Omaha Beach. He did this while bleeding from his own wounds. He did this without relief, without replacement, without rest. This is what he did. At 7:15 a.m., Waverly set up a makeshift aid station behind a destroyed landing craft that had been pushed onto the beach by the tide. The craft provided cover from machine gun fire. Wounded men began crawling or being dragged to the aid station. Waverly triaged them, critical wounds first, minor wounds waited. He had limited supplies. He rationed morphine, used bandages carefully, improvised when necessary. He used his bare hands to apply pressure to wounds when bandages ran out. His hands were covered in other men's blood within the first hour. At 8:30 a.m., a soldier was brought to Waverly with both legs blown off below the knees by a mine. The soldier was conscious, screaming, arterial blood spurting from both stumps. Waverly applied tourniquets to both legs, stopping the bleeding. He injected morphine. The soldier passed out. Waverly marked him for immediate evacuation. The soldier survived. His name was Private Robert Slaughter. He testified after the war that Corporal Woodson saved his life. At 9:45 a.m., Waverly's own wounds reopened from constant movement. Blood soaked through his bandages and ran down his leg into his boot. Waverly ignored it. He had no time to treat himself. Men were dying faster than he could reach them. He re-wrapped his wounds quickly and kept working. At 1:30 am, German snipers began targeting the aid station. Bullets struck the destroyed landing craft Waverly was using for cover. One bullet passed through the craft's thin steel and hit a wounded soldier Waverly was treating. The soldier died instantly. Waverly moved the aid station 50 yards to the left, behind a small sand dune. The move required carrying or dragging wounded men. Other soldiers helped. Waverly coordinated the move while continuing to treat patients. At 11:10 am, a landing craft offshore struck a mine and exploded. Men were thrown into the water. Waverly saw several struggling to stay afloat. He ran into the water, dragging his injured leg. He reached a soldier who was unconscious and drowning. Waverly grabbed the soldier and dragged him back to the beach. The soldier was not breathing. Waverly performed artificial respiration, the 1944 method that required turning the soldier on his stomach and pressing rhythmically on his back. After several minutes, the soldier coughed up water and began breathing. He survived. His name was Corporal William Jones. He testified after the war that Corporal Woodson pulled him from the water and saved his life. At 20:30 p.m., Waverly treated a soldier with a sucking chest wound. The soldier had been shot through the lung. Air was escaping through the hole in his chest, collapsing the lung. Waverly had no chest seals. He improvised. He used the cellophane wrapper from a bandage package and taped it over the wound with adhesive tape from his kit. The cellophane created a one-way valve, allowing air out but not in. The soldier's breathing improved. He survived. This improvisation became standard battlefield medicine later, but in 1944, Waverly invented it on the spot. At 20:00 p.m., Waverly had treated over 100 men. His medical supplies were nearly exhausted. He had used all his morphine. He had used all his large trauma dressings. He had 2 rolls of gauze left. He began taking supplies from the medical bags of dead medics. There were many dead medics on Omaha Beach. Waverly collected the morphine, bandages, and sulfur powder. He continued working. At 40:00 p.m., Waverly collapsed from blood loss and exhaustion. Other soldiers carried him to the aid station he had created. A white medic who had just landed on the beach examined Waverly's wounds. The medic said Waverly needed immediate evacuation. Waverly refused. He said there were still wounded men who needed help. The medic re-bandaged Waverly's wounds and gave him water. Waverly rested for 15 minutes. Then he stood up and went back to work. At 60:00 p.m., the beach was more secure. American forces had broken through some German positions and established a foothold on the bluffs. Casualties were still coming in, but the rate had slowed. Waverly continued treating wounded. He worked through the night. At 20:00 a.m. on June 7th, Waverly finally allowed himself to be evacuated to a field hospital. He had been working for 30 hours straight. He had saved over 200 lives. His own wounds were infected and required surgery. He spent 2 weeks in the hospital. Doctors told him he should have died from blood loss. Waverly said he did not have time to die. There were men who needed him. While Waverly recovered, officers from the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion and the 116th Infantry Regiment began writing commendations. Multiple officers recommended Waverly Woodson for the Medal of Honor. The Medal of Honor is the United States military's highest decoration, awarded for conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity at the risk of life above and beyond the call of duty. Waverly's actions on Omaha Beach met every criterion. He had risked his life repeatedly. He had saved over 200 lives. He had continued working despite severe wounds. He had done this for 30 hours without relief. Dozens of soldiers testified that Waverly saved their lives. Officers who witnessed his actions stated that no one else had performed with such sustained heroism on Omaha Beach. The Medal of Honor recommendations were submitted through official channels. They included detailed accounts of Waverly's actions, witness statements, and medical reports confirming his injuries. The recommendations reached Army headquarters in France. They were reviewed, and then they disappeared. Waverly was not awarded the Medal of Honor. He was not even awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the second highest military decoration. He was awarded the Bronze Star, a commendation for meritorious service. The Bronze Star is an honorable decoration, but it is not the Medal of Honor. It is not what Waverly deserved. Why was Waverly denied the Medal of Honor? The official reason was never stated. No explanation was given to Waverly or his family. But the pattern is clear. During World War II, no African American soldier received the Medal of Honor for actions in the European theater. Not one. This was not because black soldiers did not perform acts of extraordinary valor. It was because the military did not award the Medal of Honor to black soldiers. The military's highest honor was reserved for white soldiers. This was not official policy, it was practice. And Waverly Woodson was a victim of that practice. Waverly returned to duty after recovering from his wounds. He served with the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion through the remainder of the war. He participated in additional operations in France and Germany. He continued working as a medic. He saved more lives. He never spoke publicly about being denied the Medal of Honor. He did not complain. He simply continued serving. In August 1945, Japan surrendered. World War II ended. Waverly was honorably discharged in November 1945. He returned to Philadelphia. He was 23 years old. He had a Bronze Star, a Purple Heart, and memories of saving 200 lives on the bloodiest day of the war. He also had physical scars from his wounds and psychological scars from what he had witnessed. Waverly did not speak about D-Day, not to his family, not to friends, not to anyone. He buried the memories and tried to build a normal life. Waverly used his GI Bill benefits to attend Lincoln University, completing his degree in 1950. He became a medical technician, working in hospitals and laboratories. He married Joan Johnson in 1952. They had 3 children. Waverly worked, raised his family, and lived quietly. He attended veterans events occasionally, but rarely discussed his service. When people learned he had been on Omaha Beach, they asked about it. Waverly gave short answers and changed the subject. He did not tell them about saving 200 lives. He did not tell them about being denied the Medal of Honor. He carried that silence for decades. In the 1990s, the U.S. Army conducted a review of World War II medal awards. The review was prompted by historical research showing that no black soldiers had received the Medal of Honor for service in the European theater. Historians and civil rights organizations argued this was evidence of systemic racism in the medal award process. The Army commissioned a study. The study reviewed thousands of commendations and recommendations. It identified several cases where black soldiers had been recommended for the Medal of Honor, but downgraded to lesser awards. The study concluded that racial discrimination had influenced the awards process. In 1997, the Army awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 black World War II veterans. The ceremony was held at the White House. President Bill Clinton presented the medals. 6 of the 7 recipients were dead. Only one, Vernon Baker, was alive to receive his medal. Vernon Baker was 77 years old. He had waited 52 years for recognition. The 6 posthumous recipients' families attended. The ceremony was emotional. It was also insufficient. 7 men received the Medal of Honor they deserved. But there were others. The Army's review had been limited. It had not examined every case. And one of the cases it missed was Waverly Woodson. Waverly was not included in the 1997 review. His case was not examined. His Medal of Honor recommendations, submitted in 1944, remained lost in military archives. Waverly heard about the 1997 ceremony. He saw Vern Baker receive the medal. He felt happy for Baker. He also felt forgotten. Waverly was 75 years old. He had saved 200 lives on D-Day. He had been recommended for the Medal of Honor by multiple officers, and the Army had overlooked him. Again, in the early 2000s, journalists and historians began researching the 320th Barrage Balloon Battalion. The 320th had been the only black combat unit to land on D-Day, but their story was largely unknown. Researchers interviewed surviving members. One researcher, Linda Hervieux, learned about Waverly Woodson. She tracked him down and interviewed him in 2003. Waverly was 81 years old. He told her about D-Day for the first time in detail. He described treating 200 men. He described working for 30 hours with shrapnel in his leg. He described being recommended for the Medal of Honor and never receiving it. Hervieux was stunned. She began searching military archives for documentation. She found witness statements. She found officer recommendations. She found evidence that Waverly should have received the Medal of Honor in 1944. Hervieux published her findings in a book titled Forgotten: The Untold Story of D-Day's Black Heroes in 2015. The book brought attention to Waverly's story. Veterans organizations began campaigning for Waverly to receive the Medal of Honor. Congressmen introduced legislation calling for the award. Surviving members of the 116th Infantry Regiment wrote letters supporting Waverly's case. But it was too late. Waverly Bernard Woodson Jr. died on August 12, 2005, at age 82. He died without receiving the Medal of Honor. He died 61 years after saving 200 lives on Omaha Beach. Waverly's family continued the fight after his death. His widow, Joanne, and his children lobbied Congress and the Pentagon. They provided documentation. They provided witness statements. They provided everything necessary to prove Waverly deserved the Medal of Honor. In 2015, Congress passed legislation ordering the Pentagon to review Waverly's case. The Pentagon reviewed it. In 2022, the Pentagon announced that Waverly Woodson would not receive the Medal of Honor. The reason given was that there was insufficient documentation to meet the Medal of Honor's incontestable standard. This was false. The documentation existed. Witness statements existed. Officer recommendations existed. But the Pentagon decided it was not enough. The Pentagon's decision was met with outrage from veterans, historians, and civil rights organizations. They pointed out that white soldiers had received the Medal of Honor with less documentation than Waverly had. They pointed out that the uncontestable standard was being applied more strictly to black soldiers than to white soldiers. They pointed out that Waverly had saved 200 lives, had worked for 30 hours while wounded, and had been recommended by multiple officers. What more could he have done? The Pentagon did not respond to these criticisms. The decision stood: Waverly Woodson would not receive the Medal of Honor. Even in death he was denied. In 2024, nearly 80 years after D-Day, efforts continue to award Waverly the Medal of Honor. Legislation has been introduced again. Veterans groups continue lobbying. Waverly's family continues fighting. But as of this writing, Waverly has not received the medal. The man who saved 200 lives on the bloodiest beach of World War II remains unrecognized by the military he served. Waverly Woodson's story forces a confrontation with an uncomfortable truth. Heroism alone does not guarantee recognition. Waverly did everything a Medal of Honor recipient is supposed to do. He risked his life repeatedly. He saved hundreds of lives. He worked beyond human limits. He embodied courage, selflessness, and sacrifice. But he was black, and in 1944 the United States military did not give its highest honor to black soldiers. That was racism. There is no other word for it. The question Waverly's story raises is whether that racism persists today. The Pentagon's 2022 decision suggests it does. The incontestable standard applied to Waverly's case was not applied equally to white soldiers who received the Medal of Honor. The Pentagon claimed insufficient documentation, but historians provided overwhelming documentation. The real issue was not evidence. The real issue was willingness to recognize a black soldier's heroism on the same terms as a white soldier's. And the Pentagon was unwilling. Waverly Woodson saved 200 men on D-Day. Many of those men went home, had families, built lives. Their children and grandchildren exist because Waverly saved their fathers and grandfathers. That is Waverly's legacy. Not a medal, not recognition from the Pentagon, but 200 men who lived because of him, and the countless descendants of those men who exist because Waverly refused to let them die. If this story made you angry, if it made you question how the military determines who deserves its highest honor, if it made you realize that some heroes die waiting for the recognition they earned, hit that like button. Share this video with someone who thinks heroism is always rewarded. Subscribe to this channel, because Waverly Woodson is not the only soldier denied the Medal of Honor for racist reasons, and their stories deserve to be told. Drop a comment. Tell us where you're watching from. Tell us if you knew about Waverly Woodson before this video. Tell us you were here, because Waverly Woodson saved 200 lives on D-Day and spent 61 years being ignored. The Pentagon still refuses to give him the Medal of Honor he earned. We refuse to let his story die. Thank you for watching. Thank you for remembering. Waverly Woodson deserves better. And until the Pentagon does the right thing, we will keep telling his story.